doesn't have the armament to survive such an encounter. So the submarine needs to find its target, hit it fast, and get away. And it's certainly not possible for a submarine commander to guarantee the safety of a commercial vessel which may have a crew of dozens and hundreds of passengers, because where will it put them? It can't bring them on board the submarine. The submarine is like a sardine can. There's no room for any passengers to come on board. And normally, there isn't going to be time to allow the ship to be evacuated to lifeboats, because that then puts the submarine at risk of being intercepted by other naval patrols in the area. So there's little option in unrestricted submarine warfare except for the German commanders to find a target, attack it quickly, sink it, and get away. And that's invariably going to cause loss of life on the merchant vessel, and that's going to cause a diplomatic crisis, such as the one that resulted between Berlin and Washington in the aftermath of the sinking of the Lusitania. And this was one of the key reasons why the unrestricted campaign was gradually discontinued in 1915, and by 1916, the German submarines were generally not permitted to make these unrestricted attacks any further for fear of aggravating neutral public opinion. We see another key change in direction in Germany's submarine strategy in 1917. And by 1917, although it isn't entirely clear to the outside world, the German war effort is getting into trouble. The Germans are suffering a manpower shortage. They're finding it increasingly difficult to keep their army up to strength. And furthermore, Germany is suffering heavily from the deprivations that are being caused by the Royal Navy's distant blockade. By 1917, the blockade has become increasingly effective. Increasingly effective. So at this stage of the war, the Germans are getting desperate to find some strategic factor that they can bring to bear that may have a decisive outcome. And what is entertained in 1917 by the German High Command, including the Naval High Command, is a renewed unrestricted submarine policy, which would essentially mimic what happened in 1915, but with even greater application of resources. And the argument, once again, was that if German submarines could have free range to attack any and all neutral or enemy commercial vessels without warning, that they could eventually starve Britain out of the war. Now, this was a dubious argument based on the 1915 experience, but the Germans were willing to try anything, even if it meant aggravating American opinion to the extent that the Americans would join the war on the Allied side. Why would the German High Command take such a great risk? Because Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the German army commanders, who are effectively operating as military dictators in Germany by 1917, know deep inside that they're going to lose the war anyhow if they can't win it over the short range. So they're willing to risk American belligerency if they can knock Britain out of the war before the United States can intervene in strength. This is a calculation that they have made. At first, the Germans do a considerable degree of damage to the merchant traffic and commercial traffic that's aimed at British ports in the British Isles, including Ireland. And you can see on the left-hand map here all of the sinkings, for example, that the submarines score in the months between May and December of 1917. So they're doing a fair bit of damage, and it looks like they may be able to pose something like an existential threat to Britain, although we know in hindsight that that didn't actually materialize. The Allies, however, are able to ultimately defeat the threat posed by the German submarine strategy through a relatively simple tactical adjustment known as the convoy. And all that the convoy is a method whereby merchant vessels, rather than sailing on their own without protection from naval patrols, will be grouped together into convoys like you see on the right-hand diagram, and those convoys will be encircled and protected by Royal Naval or Allied destroyers and cruisers, which pose a significant threat to a submarine that approaches the convoy. So a submarine may be able to make a surprise attack and sink one of the merchant vessels, but if it gets caught out in the open by the destroyers or cruisers, it's going to end badly for the submarine. And this likelihood, after the convoys are enforced by the middle of 1917, discourages German submarine commanders from taking the risk of going anywhere near the merchant vessels that are sailing in the convoys. So the convoy tactic, if you want to call it a tactic, is very effective in discouraging submarine attacks. And what we find in the chart on the next page here is that as the use of convoys increases, and this is represented by sort of the double white line on the graph, as that increases between April of 1917 and the end of the war, the number of sinkings, which is represented, or the volume of tonnage sunk, which is represented by the solid black line, steadily declines toward the end of the war. So even though the convoys don't really have any special technological equipment for detecting the presence of a submarine, the simple fact that the convoy is surrounded by armed cruisers and destroyers discourages submarine attacks and essentially undermines the entire submarine strategy, causing it to fail. And it failed doubly because in April of 1917, relatively early in the 1917 submarine campaign, in April of 1917, the Americans do in fact join the war against Germany, in large part, although not wholly, because of the unrestricted submarine campaign that Hindenburg and Ludendorff have allowed to go forth. So in summary then, what we find in the First World War submarine experience is that the Germans recognized the potential for the submarine to be used as an instrument of total war by attacking commercial shipping that is bound for their enemy's home front. And these attacks not only threaten the enemy's war effort, but they also threaten the survival of the enemy civilian population by cutting off food imports. However, the Germans did not have adequate submarine strength. They didn't have enough submarines, and the submarines were not technologically sophisticated enough to wage a far-ranging and effective campaign against Allied and neutral commercial shipping, especially once convoys were introduced. Right? It wasn't realistic anymore. On the other hand, we find from a total war perspective that the Royal Navy's conventional distant blockade using surface vessels has a far-reaching impact on the German war effort, and that it also causes significant privation in the German home front, which leads to the starvation of hundreds of thousands of German civilians, right? And the undernourishment of millions of German people. Right? So the submarine seemed to have potential as a strategic weapon of total war in the First World War, but it fell short of ultimately having a decisive impact. And this is something we have to keep in mind when we're considering the submarine experience in the Second World War, which we're going to do for the remainder of this part of the lecture. We find when investigating the submarine warfare experience in the Atlantic Ocean during the Second World War, some significant parallels with the First World War, but also we'll see that there are some differences in how the campaign played out. As in the years leading up to 1914, you may be surprised that in the period before the Second World War, there was a fair bit of dismissive attitude toward the submarine on the part of naval experts. And the reason for this was that based on the failure of Germany's submarine fleet to have a decisive impact on Allied merchant shipping in 1917, that the submarine had basically seen its day. It had come and gone. It was not going to have much of a future role to play, primarily because of the effect that convoys had as an effective counter-submarine warfare measure. But furthermore, later in the First World War, actually pretty much at the end of the First World War, the Allies had developed a new technology which the British called ASDIC, but which we use more generally the term sonar to describe, which was the use of sound waves to try to detect the presence of underwater objects such as submarines. And it was felt that between convoys and sonar technology, that the submarine as a weapon which relied on the element of surprise was basically already obsolete. So if we look to Germany in particular, we find that there were sort of two prevailing attitudes to how the Second World War should be fought from a naval standpoint. And these can be sort of categorized under the names of two senior German naval officers, Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz. And Raeder argued that surface raiders should be used to attack commercial shipping, much as the Imperial German Navy had attempted to do in 1915. Admiral Dönitz argued that, in fact, U-boats should be used to attack commercial shipping, as had really been attempted most vigorously in 1917 and 1918. And neither of these German naval commanders was able to win the argument decisively by the time that war broke out in 1939. And as a consequence, neither type of navy in Germany, either the surface fleet or the subsurface fleet, was really ready for a protracted war in 1939. The German Navy just wasn't sure how it was even going to fight the next war. So what we find then is on one hand an attitude in Germany that submarines aren't going to be very useful, and then on the other hand, in the case of Dönitz, that in fact submarines will be useful as commerce raiders. But even if that was true, when war broke out, there were only about 60 operational submarines in German service, and as a function of the 1/3 rule, only about 20 of these could be expected to be at sea at any given time. And the 1/3 rule basically says that, if you have a fleet, for example, of 60 boats, at any given moment in time, you'll have 20 boats heading out to the ocean for operational duties, and you'll have another 20 coming back from their operational duties, so they'll be out of service, and you have another 20 who are in dry dock or refit being repaired and upgraded. So the bottom line is that if you have a fleet of 60 boats, that doesn't mean that there are 60 submarines operationally engaged at all times. Usually it's more like 20. So, as with the First World War, for introductory purposes, it's best to tackle the submarine war in the Atlantic in a series of stages, chronological stages. And we begin with the war in 1939 and 1940. Now, at this stage of the game, there was submarine activity against shipping around the British Isles, but it was mainly limited to close range. Because after all, the German submarines had to come out from the North Sea in between Denmark and Norway, and then work their way down toward Britain, and this took a fair bit of time